Good evening, everyone, and welcome to SocialFlight Live. I'm Jeff Simon. We have an absolutely spectacular show for you this evening. Legendary astronaut, test pilot, aeronautical engineer, and air racer Hoot Gibson is here. And his fascinating aviation story is something that we are going to talk about tonight. And so there are more stories there for us to chat about than we could ever fit into a one-hour show. But we're going to do our best to get out some of the best ones and share the evening with you. Now, before we get started, there are some very, very cool things happening I have to mention. First of all, next week is AirVenture out in Oshkosh, and I will be there. We'll be there from SocialFlight, and I hope I'll have a chance to meet you there as well. And there's this great opportunity to snag some swag and win big at AirVenture 2025, and that's because not only am I going to be walking around the show and spending time at all of the folks, those booths that you have, the people you see behind me here that support SocialFlight, support general aviation, but I'm going to be bringing a ton of swag with me. And in addition to getting like some cool SocialFlight swag just for saying hi or catching me along the way, I've also convinced a whole bunch of these folks to give away amazing prizes through us here at the show at AirVenture next week. So very cool stuff. So first of all, in case you're not going, if you're not going to the show, there's also still some benefits. If you're looking for aviation insurance, go to Avemco Insurance, mention SocialFlight, they'll give you 5% off. If you're not going to the show, we've got the Fly to Win Challenge. You use SocialFlight on your phone. You check in at any airport, even just one check-in, and you're entered in to win. And we're giving away an Aspen E5 electronic flight instrument, glass for your panel. We're just going to give that away. You just have to make sure you actually have an aircraft to install it in, and you could win that prize. So good stuff whether you're coming or you're not. But if you are coming to AirVenture and you track me down, every day we're going to have all these other prizes that we're going to give away. And basically it's about catching me and seeing, like, we'll figure out what the secret is of the day, like what number person flagged me down of the day, or what your first name or last name starts with. But we're going to give away, for example, a complete set of Michelin Pilot tires. That's top of the line tires from Michelin for someone for their aircraft. We're going to give away cases of oil. We're going to give away cases of spark plugs. We're going to give cases of oil filters. Tempest has Tempest Aero. They've come in and supplied all of that stuff for spark plugs and oil filters. Michelin, as I mentioned, for those wheels and tires. Lightspeed has come in and said a Delta Zulu headset is going to be given away right there on the spot. So there's more than I can even mention. And apologies to anyone that I have left out. But the best thing you can do is go to all of those, look for a flag that says SocialFlight Partner, and flag us down. So that's it. Just wanted to get that out, and I really hope to see all of you at AirVenture 2025. Now, tonight's broadcast is brought to us by Hartzell and Hartzell Engine Technologies. Hartzell is a leading manufacturer of aircraft engine accessories, ignition systems, fuel systems, exhaust systems, and so much more, from Skytech starters to plane power alternators, Janitrol heaters, power-up magnetos. The names you already know, chances are they actually come from Hartzell and Hartzell Engine Technologies. They have been a very, very strong supporter here to help us do our mission. And so you're going to see a lot of education coming out from that. And again, if you have any contact with them or any of our sponsors, please just tell them thank you. Tell them thank you for making all this possible and letting me do my job, come out here and share wonderful stories like tonight. And so we go to tonight's guest. Robert Lee Hoot Gibson is a former aviation naval officer and aviator, test pilot, and aeronautical engineer. He was selected as an astronaut by NASA in 1978. He flew 5 missions: STS-41B, 61C, 27, 47, 71, and 95. I mean, between 84 and 95, all those missions came in, and these missions included the groundbreaking docking mission with the Russian MIR space station. All that said, his crowning achievement with NASA may very well be serving as NASA's chief of the Astronaut Office from 92 to 94. That is one of only 4 individuals in history to hold that position. It is the person that selects crews. It is an incredible honor, and one that he truly, truly earned. However, Hoot's story extends well beyond space. As a professional pilot, a Reno Air Racer, an aircraft experimenter, working on so many other legends, including, and with so many other legends, including the late, great Bruce Bohannon. Bruce has been here on the show. He's missed dearly and also was a good friend of Hoot's. And Hoot was inducted into the U.S. Astronaut Hall of Fame in 2003, the National Aviation Hall of Fame in 2013, and has received several military decorations throughout his career. I am absolutely thrilled to have him here with us tonight. Please welcome to SocialFlight Live, Hoot Gibson. Hey there, sir.
Hey, it worked. How about that?
It worked. Thank you so much for taking time out of your evening and joining us here on SocialFlight. I had the very distinct honor to meet you at the Legends event in person. And I'm just thrilled to get to share your story tonight.
Well, thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure to join you. And golly, we chatted a little bit yesterday, and I think we're going to have a lot of fun here. I know we are.
Absolutely. So I want to start at the beginning. There are people who come from an aviation background, there are people who don't. And your story of going into the military, if you could give me an idea give everyone an idea, kind of how that began as to your first indoctrination into aviation.
Sure, Jeff. Well, I was very fortunate. I grew up in a flying family. Mom and Dad were both pilots, which is how they met. And Mom was a free spirit in the early 1940s. She and two of her girlfriends from college decided they were going to learn how to fly. So and if you're going to learn how to fly, you got to have an airplane. So the three of them bought a J2 Taylor Cub in 1943 for $900. And so they started taking flying lessons, and that's how she met my dad. So I grew up with flying, and Dad was a pilot from quite a ways back. He was in the Army Air Corps in the 1930s, and he flew the airmail the disastrous winter of 1934. And when the Army was flying the airmail for about 9 months, and they lost so many pilots that the government said, "Hey, we've got to stop this. We're going to give the contracts to the airlines and let them handle it." So my dad, I was at his college graduation. I was 10 years old when he graduated from college, and that's when his career really took off. He went to the FAA and was a test pilot and an engineering field specialist and an administrator and a manager for the FAA. So he was an aeronautical engineer and a test pilot. And I knew from the time I was about 10 years old, I want to be my dad. And
Wow.
Fortunately that worked out. He was the one who taught me how to fly. And I've been fond of saying if I have done well as a pilot, it's because Dad was the one who showed me the way.
Oh, what a wonderful sentiment. I want to go back to your mom for a minute, because that concept, three women in the 1940s buying a plane together, J2 Cub, and flying, that she must have been an extraordinary woman. That is not like just any person who does that.
That's very true. And she was. She wound up having 6 kids. And of those 6, 3 of us became pilots. 3 of them because of Mom and Dad's inspiration. 3 of us got our pilot's license. And a 4th one, my youngest sister, was on her way to getting her pilot's license. And instead she got married, and so she didn't get her, but she had soloed, and she had taken flying lessons from Dad as well. And so mom and dad rubbed off on all of us, on all 6 of us.
What are some of your fondest memories of flying with your parents?
Well, the one I remember the most, Jeff, was I was about 5 years old, and my dad and I were flying a J3 Cub, and not my mom's, but flying a J3 Cub, and he was letting me fly. I was 5 years old, and by that point, I had been flying with him a whole bunch of times, and I knew how to maneuver a Piper Cub. And he let me fly the pattern entry, the downwind leg, the base leg, roll it out on final, line up on the runway, and then he said, okay, I'm going to fly it now. Let me have it. And he took the controls. Well, I was bummed because I still wanted to fly it some more. And I held off for a few moments, and then I got back on the control stick right as we were in the flare for landing, which is a horrible place for somebody to get on your control stick. And I got my backside chewed by both mom and dad saying, you don't ever do that. When somebody else is flying, you don't ever get on the controls. And so that's why I have remembered that particular occasion so much. But I flew with mom as well. Mom flew in the Powder Puff Derby. Um,
Oh,
I think it was, yeah, she was a racer too. She was a racing pilot. And if I remember right, she flew at least twice in the Powder Puff Derby. And back then it was San Diego to Atlantic City. And first year she flew it, she was in a Cessna 140, and then the other year or 2 years in a Cessna 170. And so I remember I went flying with her on a practice flight where she was practicing, point-to-point navigation to be as efficient as you could possibly be. Which that's what
yeah.
that race was. It was an
Before
efficient.
GPS, when you had to work for it.
That's right. That's right. So anyway, I have all kinds of memories of flying with them, and back in those days too, when my dad was with the FAA, if he had an FAA airplane and he was going somewhere, they would let him take the family along. So we went along on several occasions in the FAA's Twin Beach. Uh,
Really?
and of course, Dad would put me in the right seat and let me fly it some. No takeoffs or landings at that point, because that was kind of a special airplane. But anyway, I could go. The family could go flying with my dad in those days.
Wow. That's pretty amazing. So obviously you joined the Navy. Tell me about that story and what attracted you specifically to the Navy and how what it was like to move into that.
Well, it's a little bit of a difficult story. The reason I wound up in the Navy and not in the Air Force, because what happened was, this is the 1960s. The Vietnam War was ongoing, and the draft was blazing, and the draft was everywhere. And you had 4 years to finish with a deferment, and and my problem was I was out of sequence because in one of the classes that I needed, there weren't enough people that had passed the prerequisite, and it was strength of materials, which was the lead in to the stress analysis sequence. Well, the college I was at, which was a community college that I was going to for the first 2 years, not enough people had passed the prerequisite, so they didn't offer it. They wavered it and gave me my associate's degree in engineering science, but I was out of sequence. And it was going to take me 5 years to graduate because of being out of sequence. Well, when my draft board said, well, you're not making normal progress because you're not going to graduate in 4 years. So therefore you're now 1A and we're going to draft you. And and when I got my physical notice, I said, I got to do something. So I walked down to the Air Force recruiter and he said, okay, when are you going to graduate? And I said, well, but that's the problem. I'm not going to. I'm going to be drafted right out of college. And he said, yeah, you have a problem, all right, because we don't talk to anybody until you're within 6 months of graduation. So I walked out of there figuring I'm on my way to the rice paddies. And I walked into the Navy recruiter, and the chief petty officer there said, what's your draft status? I said, 1A. And he pulls out this form letter that says, dear rotten, slimy, crummy draft board, keep your hands off this guy. We're evaluating him for an officer program. And he signed it, passed it to me to sign, folded it up, put it in his out basket, and he said, this gives us 3 months to process you. And so I'm instantly impressed. So that's how I wound up in the Navy and not the Air Force. And I think it was lucky. I think it was lucky for me to be in the Navy because we had a little different philosophy in the Navy. When you're out at sea aboard an aircraft carrier, you've got everything you're going to have. And this worked well for the space program as well. When you get to orbit, you've got everything you can have. You can wind to mission control and say, I need more fuel. They can't help you. And the same is true on an aircraft carrier. You've got everything you're going to have, so make it work. And so I did very well in the Navy because it was, we've got everything we're going to have, now make it work.
Mm. How did you take from a sort of almost a stick and rudder perspective to flying carriers? How was that experience for you?
Flying aboard the aircraft carrier is one of the most demanding and challenging stick and rudder operations because we didn't have auto land. We didn't have automatic landing, so it was manually flown. And and the Phantom, I out of pilot training, I asked for F4 Phantoms out of Miramar and San Diego, and I must have done well in pilot training because that's what I got. I was awarded F4 Phantoms out of Miramar, and so it was all stick and rudder. It was all stick and rudder landing on an aircraft carrier. And the real tiebreaker in all of that stuff was night carrier landings because and all weather. You had to be an all weather night capable fighter pilot to fly those things. And so I guess I had been fairly good at instrument flying because that's what you're doing when you're out there at night. You're flying an instrument approach. And but it's interesting, Jeff, because the approach controller you're getting basically it is a GCA. Only the controller has got two other airplanes that he's controlling. So you had to
Oh,
listen. You had to listen for your call sign because he'd say 114, you're slightly left of course, come right 3 degrees. 301, you're slightly below. In, increase your rate of climb a little bit, and you had to listen for your call sign. And then when you got to 3/4 of a mile, the call would be 201. You're 3/4 of a mile. Call the ball, and the ball is the meatball, the optical lens that showed you your glide slope. And so the call would be 201 Phantom Ball 5.0, which was 201 your side number. You're a Phantom. That makes sure they have the arresting cable set for the right airplane. And 5.0, that's your fuel state. And the LSO would come back and say, Roger Ball. And if everything went well, you didn't hear anything else from the LSO. If it was a dark night and a pitching deck, sometimes you would hear, okay, the deck's pitching, don't chase it. Because sometimes the ball would actually be moving because the deck was moving. And so it was really interesting being a carrier pilot. And it really brought out the best in you is what it did, or the worst, I guess.
that's fascinating. I didn't realize that once you've called the ball and you're inbound on that, that they're not giving you any coaching on the landing.
If you needed it, the LSO would give you come slightly right for lineup or something like that, or you're just a little bit low. Uh, Now, if you were a little bit high, they really couldn't say bring it down. That they would say don't climb. That would be the call that you'd hear. If you were going slightly high and continuing to go, the LSO might say don't climb because he wasn't allowed to say bring it down.
Wow.
And so it was fascinating and it was interesting. I had a good attitude about night because for night you started the approach out at 2 3/4 miles at 1,200 feet. And I'm trying to remember what it was. Every quarter mile you had to be 200 feet lower, something like that. And so you had an opportunity to get all perfectly stabilized on the straight in, right on speed, power set for a established rate of descent of about 600 to 700 feet a minute. And you're going to hold that all the way to touchdown. And so you had all that opportunity to get all stabilized. Daytime, you came in overhead in an overhead brake, turned to a downwind, and then you flew downwind until you were even with the back end of the carrier, with the stern of the carrier, and you started your turn. Now that looks too early, but the carrier's moving. The carrier's moving away from you. And what you had to do, Jeff, was you had to roll out lined up with the carrier at 420 feet on the radar altimeter on speed. Now you were in a turn, so you were pulling G's, so you had more power. When you rolled wings level, now you had to reestablish your power. You had to reestablish your rate of descent So in some ways, daytime was more difficult than nighttime. So
Wow.
I had a good attitude about night flying. There were some of my fellow fighter pilots that when they found out they had to go out at night the next day, they would grumble and complain and say, "How come I got to go out at night?" I didn't have that attitude, and attitude is everything.
Yeah, it is. It is. I have to tell you, the F4 Phantom is probably one of my favorite aircraft. Growing up as a kid, I had models of them. I like it, and to this day, you get next to one of those things, they are monstrous. What
It's
was your
monstrous,
experience with the Phantom? What was it like?
and it's mean looking. It's just a
Yeah,
mean
it's
looking airplane.
nasty looking. It's the
Well,
only
and,
jet you can paint teeth on.
yeah, and that's what you wanted. And my squadron, VF 111, the Sundowners, we had shark's teeth on the nose, and we had a big red and white sunburst on the vertical tail. And that dated back to World War II. VF 111, the Sundowners in World War II, they shot down so many Japanese airplanes that they became known as the Sundowners. And I flew that in combat. I flew that in Vietnam. I joined the USS Coral Sea halfway through a combat cruise that started in about, I think, September or October of 71, and we finished the end of June of 72. And we started Operation Linebacker. And
Oh,
that was what actually finally brought North Vietnam to the bargaining table. And it was that we interdicted all of North Vietnam. The bombing halt that had been in place for 4 years was canceled, and anything that was a valid military target was fair game. We never ever bombed the dikes, although they accused us of bombing the dikes. If we had done that, we would have flooded Haiphong, and we never did that because that's not a military target. But
hmm.
anyway, I flew the Phantom, and that felt really good because when you're getting shot at and when you're over unhap, un, un, uh, unfavorable territory, um, unfriendly territory, speed is really good. And even if you had a load of 3,000 pounds of bombs, we could do 500 knots in the Phantom with all those bombs on board. And so it had a lot of power, and it really felt good to be going that fast in the F4 Phantom. So what a great airplane.
Did you enjoy being part of a team as a two-person aircraft?
I sure did. I sure did. And I was when I joined the squadron on the Coral Sea. Um, I was 25 years old, and so my first flight in the squadron was a combat mission uh,
Wow.
because we were in the midst of all of this heavy combat at the time, and so that was my first flight ever in an F4B or F4 Bravo because the training squadron was F4Js.
Hmm.
And so my first flight ever in an F4B was a combat mission because we couldn't afford FAM solos or anything like that. And so, yeah, you had to learn it right away. You had to learn it very quickly. And it was Phantom was a great airplane, real solid and good on the glide slope as well. And it had J79 engines, and the J79s were not turbofans at all. They were turbojets. You move the throttle and you got RPM right now. You didn't have
Really?
to wait for it. Not like the Tomcat, the F-14 Tomcat with its TF-30 turbofans or airliners, where you move the throttle, you're going to have a delay till you get the power. The J79, you had power instantly if you move the
Wow.
throttles, and so it was just a great airplane.
Do you remember the first time experiencing being shot at?
Well, yes, it was on about my fourth mission, and what had just happened was the North Vietnam had invaded South Vietnam in a three-pronged invasion, one across the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, another one through the highlands, and the other one from Laos towards Saigon. And they had invaded across the DMZ with something like 500 tanks, um, 500 anti-aircraft guns, no SAM sites. I don't believe we had any SAM sites. And so we were there to blunt that invasion. And so we were at the DMZ, and that's the first time that I ever saw 57 millimeter flak. And 57 millimeter was gray colored, and so it was really identifiable. And it could be coupled to a radar guided gun. And so radar guided 57 can be pretty deadly because it knows where you are, it can track where you're going, it can predict where you're going to be by the time their bullet would get there. And so I'll never forget. I was number 4 in the formation. I watched 1, 2, and 3 roll in with flak going off all around them as they were in their bomb runs. And when it was time for me, I rolled into my bomb run and I said, I'm not going to be a steady target. So I was jinking all the way down. And I was pulling to the left, pulling to the right, up, down, every which way. And when my RIO, my backseater radar intercept officer, said, track, I steadied up and pointed at the target. Stand by, and means one more 1,000, and it's going to be time. And then he'd say mark, and that's when I would pickle and pull off. We came back to the debriefing after that, and my backseater didn't know what I was doing. And so in the debrief, he said, oh, God, we had one of those really screwed up bomb runs. We were never stabilized. We were up, down, we were left, right. I said, nah, that's not what I was doing. I was jinking. They howled with laughter. They thought that was the funniest thing they had ever heard of. And and actually, after the debrief was over, the operations officer, who's the senior pilot, other than the executive officer and the commanding officer, he pulled me aside and he said, "You are not to jink in a bomb run. We have gone through a lot of effort and trouble to get you there, and you need to be as perfect and stable as you can possibly be. You will not jink again in a bomb run." And I said, "Aye, aye, sir." So for a while there, I wasn't just Hoot. Oh, he's the one that kind of gave me the nickname Hoot, because when I got there, he had asked me. He said, this was Lieutenant Commander Dave Coles, and he said, "Well, kid, have you got a nickname?" He didn't say kid, but it makes a funny story because I was a kid. I was 25, and he said, "Have you got a nickname?" And I said, "Oh, yes, sir. It's Bob." And he said, "No, come on. I mean a real nickname." And I said, "Well, occasionally I've been called Hoot." That was April the 13th, 1972, and from that moment on, I was Hoot.
Wow.
That went on my name tag, Lieutenant J.G. Hoot Gibson. That went on my airplane, Lieutenant J.G. Hoot Gibson. My coffee cup, and so from that moment on, that's when I turned into Hoot.
Well,
And
Crane, weren't you always kind of going to be? Because I mean, you have Gibson, and if you've got Gibson, there was a Hoot Gibson, what westerns and stuff like that.
oh
Like,
yeah, 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 real famous movie star cowboy. I think he made over 100 films. He was a very, very well-known, successful cowboy. Turns out he was a pilot as well. Uh,
really?
yeah, so if you're last, yeah, because he flew in some kind of an air race, cross-country air race, as well, and sponsored an airplane. Oh, in the Dole Pineapple Derby, the disastrous Dole Pineapple Derby, he sponsored an airplane that raced in that. Um, so anyway, if your last name is Gibson, you're probably going to get Hoot. And my dad told me that when he flew in the Army Air Corps, he was called Hoot.
It
So it was meant to be.
was meant to be. You didn't have a choice.
Yes.
So, how did you go from F-4 Phantoms in the Navy in Vietnam to NASA?
Golly, well, there are a couple other steps in between.
Oh, well, then please take me through those because I don't want
Yeah,
to miss that.
sure. Yeah, well, I made two deployments in the F-4 Phantom, the 1972 cruise, and then we were just about to leave in February of 73 to go back to Vietnam and to war again. And all of a sudden, we got the ceasefire. And so we got our POWs back. We agreed to pull everything out of there. And so my second cruise got delayed by a month. So instead of leaving, I think we were supposed to leave in February of 73. They delayed us a month. So we left in March of 73. We still went to Southeast Asia. and we didn't have any combat. We flew some reconnaissance. We flew some escort, reconnaissance escort in the Phantom. So we were armed, and but we didn't have any combat that cruise at all. Well, towards the end of that cruise, this was a funny thing. The commanding officer was my Rio, and so he must have liked me as a pilot because the CO can pick. He was a radar intercept officer. He could have any pilot in the squadron he wanted. I wasn't the most senior pilot. By then, I was a lieutenant, which is a captain in the Air Force, only better. But at that point, I was a lieutenant. He picked me to be his pilot. Well, we were in port, and he and I were drinking a beer, and he said, "Hoot, how'd you like to make another cruise?" And I thought about it, and I said, I had over from 1972 through 1973, I had been on cruise more than I had been in California, in Miramar. And I said, well, gee, I don't know, Skipper. I'd have to think about it. And then he said, in Tomcats. And I perked up and I said, yes, sir. So what had happened was the Navy had asked all the fighter squadrons to nominate a pilot who had made at least one cruise because they figured out, you know what, we need some junior pilots in the first two Tomcat squadrons, Fighter Squadron 1 and Fighter Squadron 2. And so he turned my name in, and they picked 3 pilots off the West Coast and 3 pilots off the East Coast. And of course, I was one of the ones off the West Coast. And so I joined Fighter Squadron 1 and made the very first cruise of the Tomcat. And we left in September of '74, and we were about to come home in about March of '75. But Vietnam was falling so rapidly that they extended us a month, and so I flew combat air patrol for the evacuation of Saigon. And there was no combat, but we were armed. They credited us with a combat mission, and I launched from the carrier in a Tomcat. So the Tomcats actually had combat missions in Vietnam, which most people don't realize that.
I didn't know that.
Although, like I say, there wasn't any combat, but I had a full load of 20 millimeter cannon and sidewinders and Sparrows. No Phoenix. Um, and I held over Saigon for about 2 hours, and then came back and landed back at the carrier. And that was the end of our cruise. After that day, which was April 29th, 1975, that was the very last day of the Vietnam War. So
I'd like to ask you about that for a second. Admiral Lawrence Chambers, who's a friend, has been on the show. He commanded the Midway during the evacuation of Saigon.
Oh, golly. Yeah, the Midway was there as well.
Yeah, and has spoken certainly during the show with him and at length about how challenging that time really was. I mean, for him, the imagery that you have of throwing helicopters off the deck and getting anyone you can get on and saving as many South Vietnamese as you possibly could, and his was the one that Bird Dog landed on.
Yes.
Yeah, that was him. That was part of that.
Yeah.
How did you feel? Go ahead.
That's in the Naval Aviation Museum now, hanging up in the new annex hangar. But yeah.
They are friends, by the way, living in Florida now.
Oh, golly, I've heard that. Yeah, I've heard that.
Yeah. How did it feel for you after serving and combat in Vietnam to be doing those patrols where you couldn't engage and dealing with the fall of Saigon? Do you recall that?
Yes, and it was depressing, Jeff, as you might imagine. You thought about all those years, all the lives lost, all the difficulty, all of our POWs, and everything that this nation had gone through. The Vietnam War really divided the country, and it was a traumatic experience. And then flying that final day and landing, and then buttoning everything up and leaving basically in defeat is what we did. And that was a really depressing moment, really a depressing time. Not as bad as those that lost their lives in that conflict or spent 7 years and the like as POWs, but it was a depressing time for us.
Hmm.
Now we were headed back home, so that's a little bit of a bright spot that we're at the end of an 8.5 month cruise. So we were headed back home, but still there was a very much depressed feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. That must have been tough.
Oh, okay. So after that, I wanted to go to test pilot school, and I applied, and my air wing commander had recommended me number one of the pilots from the air wing, uh, and I didn't get selected.
Oh.
And come to find out that the Navy didn't make me available. The Navy Bureau personnel had decided that Tomcat training is so valuable and so expensive that once we get you in the Tomcat, we're not letting you out of it. And so they didn't make my name available to the selection board for test pilot school. So I was kind of mystified. And my air wing commander, though, looked into it. Smoke Wilson. He was a test pilot school graduate, and in fact, he had been operations officer, which is the senior pilot job at test pilot school. And he checked up and found out that was the reason why I hadn't been selected. And so he called the commander of test pilot school, Commander Bob Johnson, and said, "Hey, there's a guy here on my boat that you really need." Yeah, I mean, this really happened. I'm not making this up. He said, "You really need this guy." And so anyway, Air Wing Commander Smoke Wilson told me to call Bob Johnson. Holy smokes! I'm just a lieutenant, and I'm calling Commander Bob Johnson, the commandant of test pilot school. And I think I said something like, "Well, Skipper, I know I'm just Joe Blow off the street, but I really want to go to test pilot school." And he said, "No, you're not just Joe Blow off the street." He said, "What I want you to do is send me your application directly," which is unheard of in the military. There were protocols and ways that you had to send correspondence. So I did. I put my package together and I sent it directly to him. Well, he hopped in his car and he drove from Patuxent River up to the Bureau of Personnel in D.C. and flopped my application on the class desk for the test pilot school person who would wind up doing that stuff, and said, "You guys are preventing me from being able to interview this guy." So all of a sudden, the very next round, I got selected to go to test pilot school. So I had a whole bunch of help. I had a whole bunch of help getting there, from my air wing commander, obviously, and then from the skipper at test pilot school. And that's what got me into NASA, because we never selected a shuttle pilot astronaut who wasn't a graduate of test pilot school, either the Air Force test pilot school, or even better, the Navy test pilot school, or any of the other test pilot schools. So you had to have that ticket to get selected to fly the space shuttle.
How did you enjoy test pilot school? I've heard, that is that is not exactly an easy posting.
You use the word enjoy. Uh, I'm not sure that fits, Jeff. After
Yeah.
after it was over, yes, it was wonderful. But at the time, you know, it had you questioning yourself, because it was tough. It was really tough, and we had a report due every week. We would. It was fascinating. It was fascinating. We would be in class half day and then flying the other half of the day, and you flew something like 15 or 16 different airplanes in that 1 year of test pilot school. That is the hardest I've ever worked in my entire life. That was more challenging than college. It was more challenging than astronaut training. That was the hardest I've ever worked in my entire life, and it was a whole year. And I think there was one weekend that entire year that I took the whole weekend off and didn't do anything. Saturday and Sunday. I didn't work on reports or I didn't work on studying. One weekend, um, virtually every other weekend, you work the entire weekend getting ready and writing reports and turning reports in,
Yep.
and then getting a report back with red ink all over it. You know, your reports were all bleeding. Oh, golly, you were questioning yourself and
The
saying, "Am I going to pass this course?" And so, and so, yeah, it was challenging, but it was fascinating. I had always wanted to be a test pilot, and now I are one. And so it was just fascinating. It was a dream come true.
Do you remember what your sort of final exam um, evaluation was in test pilot school? Because I have to tell you, I was over at Fred Gregory's home, spending time with him and his family, and he pulled out his original. He's like, he just pulled it out. He's like, this was my last like exam, like the evaluation I had to do to get out of test pilot school, which he didn't even have time to finish. At the very end, he just wrote "Go Navy" on the last page and turned it in. Do
Of
you
course,
remember
I
what your
remember. How could you
effort was?
forget something like that? And it was what was called an NPE, a Navy Preliminary Evaluation. And so the scenario is, okay, we're considering this airplane for a Navy fighter. And since I was a fighter guy, I got a fighter. It was the F-101 Voodoo was
Oh,
was my
holy
fighter,
mackerel! That's
and
cool.
that was cool. And what you got, Jeff, was you had 4 flights. You could have 4 flights or 6 hours. Well, in the F-101 Voodoo, with those great big giant engines that it has and very little fuel, you were not going to get 6 hours. You were going to get 4 flights and probably maybe 4.5, 5 hours total is what you were going to be able to do. And your challenge was to evaluate as much as you possibly could about that airplane in the course of 4 flights, and then write a comprehensive report on everything that you could pull together after having flown that. So it wasn't just performance; it was stability and control as well. And
Oh
so
yeah.
you had force gauges where you would measure the stick force per G, is a parameter that's important. And what you'd like to see in an airplane, stick force per G, you'd like to see a nice linear curve. So 2 Gs is 5 pounds, 4 Gs is 10 pounds, 6 Gs is linear, nice linear curve. You didn't want to see something curvy. Yeah, I say linear curve, a straight line. So
Yeah.
anyway, it was to evaluate as much as you possibly could in the space of 4 flights, and then write a report. And I'll never forget my monitor for this. Well, first thing you had to do was you had to write a test plan. You had to draft a test plan. And the rule at test pilot school was plan the flight, fly the plan. You could not deviate from that plan. You didn't add things in. You could only do the things because they had lost a pilot and an A4 because he decided to try one more thing a couple years before I got there. And it wasn't in his test plan, and it was something he never should have done, and it killed him. Uh,
Hmm.
so and so you had to write your test plan, get that approved. Okay, now you're all set to go fly the thing. And we had an F-101 Voodoo that came down from Niagara Falls with an instructor pilot, and he flew in the back seat and I flew in the front seat. And man, what a rocket ship that thing was! It was a real hot rod. It was built to be an interceptor, not a dogfighter. And it wasn't a dogfighter. It had tiny, tiny wings and huge engines. And of course, that's interceptor. The bombers are coming in. We've got to intercept the bombers. So you launch, climb to altitude in 4 minutes. 4 minutes to get to 30,000 feet. Fly out at 1.6 Mach, intercept the bombers, shoot them down with the Genie missile, which was a nuclear tip missile, could be a nuclear tip missile. And so I had to make up a mission for it for the Navy. And so, and they said, we don't care what you call it, just come up with some mission. And so I said, I'm evaluating this airplane for use as a close support interceptor for Navy shipping in coastal waters. So it was going to be land-based because that thing could not land on a carrier. It's just way too fast. And so anyway, that was my airplane, and I did my 4 flights in it. My monitor instructor from test pilot school was Mike Smith, who was selected as an astronaut the class after me in 1980, and he was on his first mission, which was the Challenger accident. He was on his first trip to space, so I'll never forget Mike Smith. Just because, well, I had a number of reports that he graded for me, and they had red ink all over them. And I'll never forget my graduation exercise, no red ink on it whatsoever. And I have it. I still have it. And I have his handwritten report, comments on my report at the end of it. And it ran along the lines of, Hoot, you can be really proud of what you have accomplished here at Test Pilot School. Just look at this report. And so after all the bleeding and all the self-doubt that you went through at the very end of it, it all came out great. It just all came out great. And so I treasure that report, and I treasure his handwritten notes, as you might imagine.
I can only imagine. And so that is what got you to NASA.
Yes. Well, let's see. Okay. I don't know. I might have to brag just a little bit. Well, this was
Please
funny.
do. Please.
Well, this was funny because there were 2 awards at Test Pilot School. There was the NPE award. So whoever did the best job on the Navy preliminary evaluation, their graduation exercise, that was an award. The other one was called Outstanding Student. And when Mike gave me my report and debriefed me on it, I said, oh, wow. I said, he gave me an A on it, and that's unheard of. A C plus was perfectly fine in any of your reports going through Test Pilot School. And they hammered that into us. They said, look, you guys are all stars, or you wouldn't have been selected to come to Test Pilot School. C plus is just fine. Anyway, I got an A on that one from Mike, and I said, wow. I said, I guess that might put me in the running for the NPE award. And he said, oh, you don't need to worry about that. And I was a little bit deflated because he'd obviously told me, no, you're not getting that award. And then graduation night, they called my name for Outstanding Student. And
Wow.
I think that had a huge part in me getting picked up by NASA, because Test Pilot School is very competitive, and they named me Outstanding Student. So I hate to brag about it, but that I'm sure had a really strong bearing on me getting picked by NASA.
Had you thought about going to space throughout your life, or was that really something that happened then?
Most of the astronauts would tell you, oh, sure, I wanted to be an astronaut from the time I was about 5 years old, and that's BS. Because when I was 5 years old, there weren't any astronauts. We didn't have astronauts till 1961. And so, and actually, Jeff, the truth is, I wasn't interested in riding a rocket. Those things didn't have wings. I'm an airplane person. Mom and Dad were airplane people. They taught me airplanes, and they taught me things with wings. I wasn't interested in flying the Apollo rocket or the Gemini or any of those things. And what really changed my mind was in early 1974, I was in my Tomcat squadron, and 4 of the astronauts came to Miramar, and I was picked to show them the Tomcat. And in fact, I got to go out and fly against Joe Engel and the Air Wing Commander in a T-38 in my Tomcat. We were going to dogfight. And I demonstrated a maneuver to them, and I broke the air data computer, and I had to go back and land, so we didn't get to dogfight. So that was disappointing. But they told me all about, hey, this newfangled spaceship called the Space Shuttle that's going to be coming along here in a couple of years. And then I remember looking at Aviation Week magazine, and here was an artist drawing of a space shuttle gliding back into land. So here's a rocket that has wings on it, and I said, I have got to get me one of those. And so from that point on, I was pretty obsessed with getting to fly the space shuttle, and I was already on the right track. I wanted to go to test pilot school, and I had figured out I'm going to have to be a test pilot school grad if I want to fly the space shuttle. So it all fell in place. I had just graduated from test pilot school, uh, June or July of '77, and that was right when NASA started interviewing applicants for the 1978 class. And so I had my my test pilot school ticket in just barely in time, and got to interview that summer of '77. And like I say, I know that being designated the outstanding student in my test pilot school class must have carried a lot of weight with the selection board.
Wow. I assume you remember the call when you got selected and who called you?
How could I forget that, Jeff? Yeah, absolutely. It was from George Abbey. Uh,
Yep.
and there's a book about him written by Michael Cassett called The Astronaut Maker, because for about a generation there, he was who selected the astronauts, and he was the one that selected who flew on which mission and all of that. And anyway, I got to work a little bit late that morning at strike aircraft test, because one of the other test pilots had asked if I could give him a ride to work that morning. His car was getting worked on or something, so I had picked him up, and I got there a little bit after 7:30, and I had one of those notes, those little yellow notes that you were called by, please call, and it said George Abbey. And I think my heart froze for a moment. And so, and of course, I called him immediately. And of course, George was a funny guy. He'd kind of beat around the bush with you and play around with you a little bit. And so I get on the phone with him, and he said, well, okay, I still have that note, by the way. I have that yellow note. I've saved it. Anyway, um, he said, well, we're just kind of wondering if you might still be interested in flying the space shuttle. And I wanted to say, "Are you shitting me?" Of course I want. I didn't say that. I said, "Yes, sir. Of course I'm still interested in flying it." And he said, "Okay, well, if you're not adverse to it, if you're not against it, we think we'd like to go ahead and select you for this class." And I don't know what I said to that. I probably babbled something like, this has got to be the greatest day of my life, something to that effect. Um, and anyway, the direction was, okay, don't tell anybody about it. You can maybe tell your immediate family. The announcement isn't going to go out until about 4 o'clock this afternoon. So keep it to yourself, at least till the end of the day. And And so, what a great day I had, though. Right after that, I was scheduled to fly a 3-hour flight in the Tomcat, and we were doing extended, oh golly, getting as many hours on the engines and the airplane as we possibly could, so that we would be leading the fleet in flight time, so that if things are going to break, they're going to break for us. So anyway, it was about an hour and a half, 2-hour flight, land, hot refuel, take off again and fly for another hour and a half or whatever it was. And then the end of the day, I was flying down to Orlando. So I still remember that day. That was January the 16th, 1978. And so flew airlines down to Orlando to work on the new F-14 simulator, with Naval Training Center, which was right there at the Orlando airport. So yeah, I'll never forget that day. So when Larry Balcom and I got airborne in my Tomcat, I said, okay, I'm not supposed to talk about this, and so don't tell anybody. But I told him the news. And so later in the day, he and I were both flying down to work on the new simulator, the two F-112, for the F-14 Tomcat. So yeah, how am I ever going to forget that day? I never will.
That's incredible. And so tell me a little bit about your training and kind of the connection between your flight test experience and the fact that you were a test pilot on the most amazing vehicle ever built in history to that point.
Well, yes, and it was interesting because I walked out of the Navy Flight Test Center, obviously on top of the world. I was an accomplished test pilot. I had a year of test pilot experience after test pilot school, so I had done a number of really interesting projects. Um, there had been an F-14 accident that was caused by single engine, and airplane taken off out of Oceana. There was a little problem with the vent tank back at the back of the Tomcat that would fill up with excess fuel, and then on takeoff, sometimes the spring would not be strong enough to keep it from spilling out, and some of that fuel would spill out. And if you were an afterburner, you would ignite it. And so Tower called this airplane and said, Tomcat, your left engine's on fire. And so he shut down the left engine. And now he got, so he's heavyweight, single engine, in a big hurry to land. And he wrapped it up on final, and he was getting slow. And he went to afterburner on the other engine, the right engine, and it yawed the airplane into the ground.
Oh.
And both occupants were killed.
Hmm.
And so I wound up doing some flight testing, and what was in the flight manual at the time, the NATOPS, Naval Air Training and Operating Procedure Standardization. The NATOPS manual was, the airplane is essentially centerline thrust. That's what was in the flight manual. And it was so wrong, it was incredible. And so I wound up rewriting the entire NATOPS manual, and I just bought an F-14 manual, NATOPS manual, about 2 or 3 years ago, and the write-up that I made is still the write-up that was in that book right to the very end. So
how wonderful.
I completely rewrote the single engine characteristics section of the flight manual, and it included the things that we all know about multi-engine airplanes. Avoid turns into the dead engine, and fly a 5-degree heading into the good engine, and things like that. So things that we all know from multi-engine airplanes. The Tomcat NATOPS manual was in error and contributed to this accident. So anyway, I had a whole year of being a test pilot at Pax River. So I walked out way on top of the world, and then I checked in at NASA as I was the youngest pilot that they picked in the 1978 class. They picked 15 pilots and 20 other than pilots, mission specialists. Right. I walked in the door at NASA, and I came to realize, man, am I ever dumb? I don't know nothing. I don't know anything about space. How do I generate electrical power on a rocket? How do I do heating and cooling? How do I navigate? I didn't know anything about space. And so all of a sudden, I was the smartest person at Patuxent River. I wasn't really, but I was way on top of the world. And all of a sudden, I'm really dumb. And so that was a rude awakening. And so we had so much to learn. And NASA brought us in then because they thought that we were 6 months away from the first shuttle launch. It wound up being 3 years. And so we didn't launch till April of 1981. And I had a bunch of really fascinating projects to work on. I got to be a chase plane for STS-1 and STS-2, the first 2 shuttle launches. And then
in the T-38?
In the T-38s. Yeah, no, we had specially modified T-38s because the T-38 didn't have enough drag to fly with a big draggy space shuttle. So the configuration that we would put the T-38 in was landing gear down, flaps to 40%, because we could go to 300 indicated with flaps at 40%. And we had modified speed brakes, 50% bigger than a standard T-38. So they had red and white, big red and white stripes on them so that you couldn't fail to notice the fact that you had modified speed brakes. And that gave us enough drag that we could stay with the space shuttle in a 20-degree dive, heading downhill, and not be going supersonic. So we needed to have all that drag. And so that was fascinating, to try to rendezvous with a space shuttle coming back in because he can't wait for you. You better be at the rendezvous point on time, or you've lost it because he can't wait for you. He's going to be pressing on down the rest of the way. So that was fascinating, and it was early 1983. I was working as the deputy chief out at Ellington Air Force Base for NASA, um, and I had a meeting with George Abbey, director of flight operations. And I'll never forget this, Jeff. I was totally unsuspecting. And I walked into his office because he had asked me to come by. And so walked into his office, and Vance Brand was in there as well. And I didn't think anything of that. There were other astronauts in with him all the time. And I had been out there as the deputy chief, out of sight, unseen. Nobody knew what you were doing. It was an important job because the chief out there really liked to fly, so he was gone all the time. So you needed somebody that was going to be there to keep everything running. So I was the deputy chief. And anyway, George says to me, "Okay, Hoot, you've been out there at Ellington now for about a year. Have you given any thought to what you'd like to do next?" And I said, "Well, yes, sir. I guess everybody says they would kind of like to be a Capcom, which is the capsule communicator, the person in mission control that actually talks to the shuttle. It had to be another astronaut." I said, "Everybody, I guess, says they'd like to be a Capcom, so maybe I'd like to be a Capcom next." And what he said next, I'll never forget. He said, "Well, do you have any interest in any of the upcoming missions?" This was another one of those moments. Uh, well, yes, of course. And he said, "Okay, well, if you're not against it, then maybe you and Mr. Brand here will go fly STS-11." And so once again, I think I babbled. I don't think I knew what to say. He just blindsided me totally with that. And it was the same kind of deal. Okay, you can tell your wife, but kind of keep it quiet because the announcement isn't going to go out till, actually, I think in this case it was tomorrow. It was the next day. And actually I had to travel the next day because I was signed up to do a public appearance out in Camarillo, California. And they called me when I was out there, and they said, "Okay, the announcement just went out, so you can talk about it while you were there." And so I was speaking to this whole bunch of people at 3M, the 3M factory there in Camarillo. And I was able to say, "Oh golly," and I just got notified that I'm going to be flying the 10th launch of the space shuttle in February. Big round of applause. Everybody cheered and yelled. So, another one of those exciting moments.
Oh, how wonderful.
So it had taken 4.5 years from when I walked in the door to where I got assigned to my first mission. And then you trained for a full year. Every time you were assigned to a mission, you trained for another full year to get as smart on that mission as you possibly could.
So the ultimate question, which you've been asked a million times, what is it like to fly the shuttle? When you're flying it, when you're
Yeah,
actually gliding it.
yeah, it totally ruins you for roller coasters because there's not an amusement park ride on Earth that comes anything close to that. You had flown the simulator. I probably had 1,000 hours in the simulators, but they aren't accelerating at 3Gs like the shuttle does. And you're not seeing the view of the Earth. You have a computer generated view of the Earth that you're looking at. That's not the same as the first time I saw the west coast of Africa about 10 minutes after launch on my way to orbit on Challenger. And it is so exciting. Even though you knew exactly what was going to happen, you knew that, yeah, you were going to see the west coast of Africa come across at about 10 minutes after we launched. But you emotionally, you're still never quite as prepared for when you actually get to see it. So it was pretty spectacular. And then, oh golly, it just kept getting better, Jeff. My first mission, I was the pilot, which really means co-pilot. But the joke I like to tell is, the two pilots on the shuttle are the commander and the pilot. The pilot is really the co-pilot, But astronauts are such prima donnas, nobody's willing to be called co-pilot. So they were commander and pilot. So for my second launch, though, now I'm the commander. So I'm the one that gets to land it. And at the time, John Young, the chief astronaut, had said, okay, the pilots don't get to do any flying. They do not get to even feel the controls for 30 seconds on the way down. We need the most experienced person flying it all the way down, which I thought was kind of blindsiding, and kind of eliminating an opportunity for some training.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I was chief astronaut, I said, I want the commanders to give the pilot 20 seconds, 30 seconds, and let them fly it just a little bit so they have felt what it's like, and they have that little bit of confidence built up that, okay, I have flown it. I can fly this thing. First time I got my hands on the control stick was coming back to land at the end of a 6-day mission and making an unplanned night landing. We were supposed to land right at daybreak, and for 3 days in a row, the weather refused to cooperate. And finally, on the third day, mission control said, okay, guys, we give up. Take it one more orbit and bring it into Edwards Air Force Base. And any landing other than landing at Cape Canaveral early in the morning, any other landing was going to be a night landing. So my pilot, Charlie Bolden, Major General Charlie Bolden eventually, and I had done most of our training at night, because if you can land it at night, you can certainly land it in the daytime. So it was an unplanned night landing, but I could see that might happen, and so we did the majority of our training at night. And so it was an uneventful landing.
Wow.
And so, but it's a different flying kind of machine, because you have no engines. All you can do is close the speed brakes a little bit so you can somewhat reduce the amount of drag, but you can't add any energy to it. And so it's a fascinating airplane to fly.
What's the flare like?
Well, the flare, we would intercept, we'd roll wings level on final 6 miles from touchdown at 12,000 feet. That was the altitude you'd be at. 6 miles from touchdown, 12,000 feet is where you'd roll wings level. And so you're coming down in a 20-degree glide and at 300 knots indicated, and you hold that dive down to 1,700 feet above the ground. And that was a place that we called pre-flare. And so at 1,700 feet, you would do about a 1.4 G pull to intercept a 1.5 degree glide slope. So, all of our ILSs are generally 3 degrees. But we would intercept a 1.5 degree glide slope, and we had an optical system. It was a ball bar, and sort of like the aircraft carrier ball that we had there, where you had datum lights and then a ball in the middle. We would intercept a 1.5 degree glide slope, and you would hold that down into the final flare. And then as you got close to the final flare, you wanted to really minimize your control inputs, because almost anything that you did was going to be wrong. And so what I mean by that is, let's say I had a little bit of an excessive sink rate at 30 feet. So what am I going to do? I'm going to pull back on the stick. Okay, with the shuttle, it has elevons on the back of the wing, so the elevons go up. That's like putting your flaps up. You just killed lift. So you're going to come down faster briefly. And then once the angle of attack change takes effect, now you've got more lift. And the opposite is true as well. If you were a little too high and you push the stick forward, you put your elevons down. So I just put flaps down, so I got more lift. And so you'd go the wrong way. So the closer you got to touchdown, the less you wanted to be doing with your pitch control. And a perfect landing in the shuttle would happen if, for about the 5 or 6 seconds prior to main gear touchdown, you hadn't made any pitch inputs. So that's a whole lot different from anything any of us have ever flown before.
Yeah.
But that was the way you had to fly the thing.
Yeah.
And once you learned how to do that, it was very repeatable and very, very consistent.
Wow.
But it sure took some learning. I'll never forget, Jeff. We would have the test pilot school students uh, come to Johnson Space Center to visit NASA, and we'd show them around, and I'd take them in the simulator, and I'd let them fly it. We'd set them up at 10,000 feet and let them fly the approach down to touchdown. Virtually every one of them would crash it on their first try because it wasn't hard to fly. It was just different. The way
Right.
it flew was so much different that you had to learn the difference. And so it was an interesting vehicle to land.
Fascinating. Um, I know even though we're over time, I do want to ask you though about your MIR mission with Charlie Precourt and that side, because that's flying, that's piloting it in space, and I know you also uh, have managed to practice rescue maneuvers in space. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, yeah. Now the mere docking was something I wasn't planning on doing at the time. It was time to assign a crew. I was the chief astronaut, and so I'm the one picking the crews. And I had been asked several years earlier, "Are you going to assign yourself to the mere docking?" And I said, "No, that's not the job of a leader. I'm the leader of the astronauts. I'm not here to skim off the good deals for myself. I'm not going to assign myself to that." Well, long story short, NASA insisted from way up at the top, NASA headquarters insisted that I go do it. And I found out years later it was because the Russians were nervous. Um, the Apollo Soyuz docking, there had been two dockings. One of them was flown by Tom Stafford, the mission commander. The other one was flown by Deke Slayton. And one of them, we hit them so hard we nearly broke the docking mechanism. And now, 20 years later, here we come with our $250,000 space shuttle to attack their space station, and the Russians were nervous. So NASA told the Russians, "Hey, look, this is so important. We're sending our chief astronaut to command the mission." And I fought it for about a month and then finally got told, "Hey, okay, shut up and go do the mirror docking." And it was fascinating. So I was so lucky I got to do it. So lucky I got to fly with Charlie Precourt. He is such a gifted aviator and such a gifted leader and such an all-around great person that was really a wonderful experience. We had a real challenge. Um, the docking had to be flown manually by the commander, and and I had to line up the center of the docking ring, which is about a 4-foot diameter ring, with the center of the docking ring on the station. The centers had to be lined up within 3 inches, or else we would bounce off. And so, here we are going 17,500 miles an hour, and I've got to line my vehicle up within theirs within 3 inches. Well, fortunately, we had done about 100 dockings in the simulator, and we had really figured out how to do it. Now, okay, I'm the one actuating the controls and firing the jets and the pulses to do it all, but I had a whole crew working with me on it. So I wasn't doing this by myself. Charlie Precourt and my flight engineer, Greg Harbaugh, and Bonnie Dunbar were all intimately involved in tracking our progress all the way in, and the contact velocity had to be 1/10 of a foot per second. Well, you think about that, that's 1.2 inches per second. That's pretty slow.
Mm.
And they told me if you hit it at 2/10 of a foot per second, you'll break the mechanism. So, so no pressure. You got 1/10 of a foot per second, plus or minus 0.03 feet per second. And we actually hit them at 0.107 feet per second. So 7/700ths of a foot per second off. So
Wow.
it went extremely well. And we were 7/10ths of an inch off. And again, that wasn't just me. That was a team of people who had learned to do this in the simulator and learned to do it very well. And that was fascinating.
And then the last thing about maneuvering, you did get an opportunity to actually maneuver in space and simulate rescuing an
Oh,
astronaut.
yes. On my first mission, which was aboard Challenger, we did the world's first untethered spacewalks. And so there's that iconic photo that it turns out I was the photographer for, of Bruce McCandless floating at an angle to the horizon, moving away out 300 feet away. Well, people ask all the time, what if he ran out of fuel? What if he had an electrical malfunction in his rocket pack? Well, the answer was we had trained in the simulator to be able to rescue him. Now, that wasn't needed, but after that iconic spacewalk, one of the boys out there on the spacewalk in the cargo bay kicked loose a foot platform. And the foot platform was floating away from the cargo bay and going away. And Vance Brand, my commander, said, I'm going to go rescue it. Let's go rescue it. So we brought up the procedure, which was called EVA crew member rescue. And we had to switch from the small thrusters, the 25-pound thrusters, which we were using to maintain attitude, to the 900-pound thrusters, because that's what we have to fire to translate. And so we brought those up. We told Bruce and Bob, our spacewalkers, hey, get in the cargo bay and hang on. And we flew over and we rescued the foot platform. We flew it into the cargo bay. Vance flew it into the cargo bay, and Bruce McCandless reached up and grabbed it. So it's probably $100,000 foot platform. So it was a good thing that we rescued it. So we actually got to exercise the EVA crew member rescue procedure.
How wonderful. Like that is so cool. I love that. Well, Hoot, you know what I'm going to ask. You're going to need to come back
Okay.
because
No, we didn't
because we have
cover.
so much more to talk about. We
I know
haven't got.
we didn't cover half of the stuff. We didn't talk air racing at all. That was
I
exciting too.
know. I want to talk about your cassette racer that you built. I want to talk about your FAI, your 2 aviation world records that you set, that the equivalent to the SR-71. There's just so much more. Will you please come back on the show so I can?
I'll be happy to, Jeff. This is fun. So yes, yeah. Let me know when. Yeah, we can do it again.
Absolutely. I would be grateful. Thank you so much. And I would like to end on a quick note, which is our Social Flight Fast 5, where we go through 5 questions so we can share with people just a little bit more personal about you. Would you be game for that?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Legendary astronaut Hoot Gibson, this is your Social Flight's Fast 5. 5 questions just to get to know you just a little bit. And I'd like to start with question number 1. You have flown so many different aircraft, going all the way back to before you could walk, being inside that Cub with your mom and your dad, all the way up to the space shuttle. Is there a specific or some aircraft in your history that you really believe is closest to your heart?
The airplane that I enjoyed the most, and this was another area we didn't get to talk about at all, and this was something I flew in air shows, the Russian MiG-21. What a hot rod that thing is. Half of the fuselage is engine. So it's a flying engine with a couple of little small delta wings, but what a hot rod. What a cool airplane.
I love that. All right, perfect. And a placeholder for the next time you come back on, where we're going to talk air shows, air racing, design of experimental aircraft, all that fun stuff. MiG-21, perfect. Okay. Question number 2 of your Fast 5. Was there a particular, in your aviation world, was there a particularly scary or impactful experience that you had that really changed the way that you learned something from and changed the way you approach aviation?
Not that made a big change in me. I was on just kind of off the top of my head, Jeff. What I have come up with. I was on one of my solo cross countries in a Luscombe 8A, which is a tail dragger.
Yep.
Kind of similar to a Piper Cub, only it's side by side seating. And I was flying from Long Island down to an airport that used to be there in northern Pennsylvania called Highline Airport. And I one of my landmarks was a city right on a river, and then I fly for about 5 minutes and I find the airport. Well, I did that, and I didn't find the airport. And I started circling a little bit, and I said, I'm going to get myself lost. I better go back to the river. So I went back to the river, and I figured out that the city that I had picked as my landmark was not the right city. And so
Mm,
I flew down the river a little bit, got to the correct city, then flew the 5 minutes, and I found that airport. And
wow.
so that was very memorable for me because I was lost and there wasn't another airport in that area. And so, if you ever find yourself lost, go back to where you know right where you were and
Mm.
figure it out from there. So yeah, that taught me a lesson.
That's excellent, excellent advice. I like that, and it makes sense, and it's certainly very, very applicable to pilotage for anyone.
Yes, yes.
Okay, question number three. If you had the opportunity to go back to some moment to re-experience it, not to change it, not to do anything differently, just some moment of your aviation and space world that you wish you could just be there and soak it in for a minute, what would that be?
Gee. Well, it might be one of the other events that we didn't get to talk about. It happened in air racing. I raced at Reno in the unlimited class altogether 14 years. And the final year that I raced, I was flying a really hopped up, souped up Mustang P-51 named Strega, which
Yep.
is an Italian word meaning which in Italian. And I was cranking 3,000 horsepower out of that 1,900 horsepower Rolls Royce Merlin, and I won the unlimited championship, and I set the speed record for the 8 lap championship race that still stands to this day, 488.983 miles per hour average for the 8 laps. And after that, I'll never forget one of the TV interviews that happened to me. I was surrounded by people when I climbed out of the airplane, of course, because this was the unlimited championship. And one of the questions I got was, how does this compare with being a space shuttle commander? And my answer was, you know what? This ranks right up there with being a space shuttle commander. After having raced at Reno 18 years altogether to win the big championship, that was a huge, huge thrill.
Ah, how wonderful. I love that. I absolutely love that. All right, question number four. If you could go back in time to your younger self in your teens or your 20s and give some advice, some sage advice based on your experience now, what would you say?
I would tell myself to be a little more cautious. Um, One of the things that I did after my dad soloed me in this Luscombe 8A was I was part of a swim team uh, at in Vienna, Virginia, and it was an outdoor pool. And the first time my dad said, "Okay, you don't have to stay in the traffic pattern. You can go out and fly around a little bit." What did I do? I went right back to Vienna, Virginia, and buzzed my swimming pool. And my dad got a letter from the FAA, and because he was FAA at the time, they said, "Luscombe 23038 has been buzzing Vienna. Take care of this." So he did. So he did. I got a rather severe talking to, and he asked me if I had $1,000 to pay the $1,000 fine that would have come in if he weren't FAA. And so, don't be a cowboy. Would be my advice. And so I think I
I,
learned something from that.
I love that. I absolutely love that. And we're gonna have to do some more talking offline. I didn't realize you were from Vienna. I grew up there. So
Oh,
like
no
I'm
kidding.
yeah,
James
I
Madison,
was a Reston boy.
James Madison High School. Yeah, I went for
Well,
2 years at James Madison High School.
we will talk, my friend. We have more to
Okay.
talk about.
Okay.
All right, our last question of the evening in Social Flight's Fast Five. If you could choose anyone, alive or no longer with us, someone famous, someone not, someone from your world, it doesn't matter, anyone to spend an evening with, who do you think you might pick?
Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh. I will never forget being fascinated by the Spirit of St. Louis. And I made several model airplanes of the Spirit of St. Louis. And after seeing the movie, The Spirit of St. Louis, with Jimmy Stewart playing the part of Charles Lindbergh, I would love to have been able to sit down and spend an evening with Charles Lindbergh. That would have been fascinating.
Absolutely. Great answer, especially the tying it to the movie. I think that's really cool.
Right, right. Oh, and I got to fly the replica many years later up at
Really?
Oshkosh. They let me fly the replica of the Spirit of St. Louis. What a horrible flying airplane that was. But what a thrill, because that is such an iconic machine, such an iconic airplane.
You've got to be the only one that Jack Pelton and gang would toss the keys to the Spirit of St. Louis to.
Well, this was when Paul Poberesny was the leader there, and
All
so
right, when Paul would do it.
yeah, yeah,
Same answer, by the way, though.
same answer. Yeah, exactly.
Well, Hoot, thank you so much. I'm really grateful for the time that we've spent this evening, and I do sincerely hope that we'll put another date on the calendar and get to the rest of it because I'm so fascinated by your story of experimental aviation and air racing and all the rest of it that it would be a disservice not to make sure that we get time to spend talking about that.
I agree. I agree. Great idea, Jeff. Let's plan on doing that.
You got it. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful evening.
All right. Thank you. I sure enjoyed this.
All
Bye for
right,
now.
take care. Bye. And thanks to all of you for joining us this evening on Social Flight Live and for everything that you do to support general aviation. For those of you who might be going up to Oshkosh and AirVenture 2025, keep an eye out for me. Again, I would love to meet you in person. I'll have prizes, swag, so many other things. All you need to do is see the folks that are on this board, see the flags that we've got out there, their partner flags at those companies. Please go visit them. Again, that's Aspen Avionics, Avemco, Avidyne, Continental Aerospace Technologies, Hartzell Propeller, Hartzell Engine Technologies, Lightspeed, Michelin, Phillips 66, Tempest Aero, U Avionics, and Whip Air. And go say hi to them. Tell them. Tell them thanks for making all this possible. It's really quite wonderful. And hopefully you can win something along the way. So again, thank you for joining us. We will be back on Tuesday, July 29th with F-15 pilot Don Master Yates. He has some very cool stories as well. And then as we talked about tonight, we'll be booking another show with Hoot Gibson for the future. Until next time, I'm Jeff Simon for Social Flight, and I wish you all blue skies.